Greetings. Welcome to the 2019 Research Overview, featuring our crew of ambitious and dedicated scientists and agents of social change. Here in central Kansas, and much of the Midwest, you might find this surprising. The year started out wet, and it just got wetter. According to K-State agronomy updates, May marked the rainiest month ever recorded in the state of Kansas. And people have said that this summer was the wettest in Saline County since 1993. This made many tasks, such as weeding breeding plots and coring soils, very challenging. But some of the crops loved it. Who knew that perennial sorghum would tolerate flooding so well? Really, who knew? 11 time zones away, speaking of tolerating flooding, 11 months ago and 11 time zones away in the province of Yunnan, China, our close collaborators at Yunnan University released the perennial rice PR23 as an official variety after being trialed on more than 7,500 acres. This really happened. PR23, which is a wide hybrid cross between an annual rice, Oryza japonica, and a perennial cousin, Oryza longistaminata, yields essentially the same as annual rice at close to 15 tons per hectare per year for up to 3 years now, 2 harvests per year. And you already may be some of the first people in North America to taste the perennial rice as it was being served in a couple of dishes cooked up at Umami Bowl and maybe another food truck. Just Umami Bowl, okay? It's not a pitch for Umami Bowl, but if you want to taste perennial rice, you might want to stop by there. In other international news, some of you might remember a research meeting that the Land Institute and TLI supporter Melinda Merrill of the Estes Institute hosted in 2014 at the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado. That meeting marked a major expansion in research partner collaborations for the Land Institute. Well, this year, 5 years after Estes Park, we had a follow-up meeting over 5 days in May, bringing together close to 100 researchers from 15 countries, 6 continents, representing plant breeding and genetics, ecology, plant physiology, agronomy, social sciences, and some brilliant folks from the humanities. The Land Institute was one of the hosting institutions, but the meeting itself took place in southern Sweden at Lund University's Pufendorf Institute for Advanced Studies. Pufendorf Institute for Advanced Studies. This institute defines itself as an interdisciplinary center with the aim to stimulate collaboration between researchers from different disciplines. It certainly succeeded in this meeting. Lennart Olsen, who we listened to this morning, and one of the most recent additions to the board of directors at the Land Institute, was hugely instrumental in making this meeting happen, as was his postdoc, Eleanor Isgren, and a number of generous funders from both Sweden and the US. The talk that I gave in Lund focused on energy, and I would like to highlight a few of the more deluxe ideas from that talk today. It's about energy. Energy has been a major theme, as you might have noticed, at this year's Prairie Festival, and is a big reason why we got into agriculture in the first place. You see, by eliminating wild plants and replacing them with crop plants, we increase the amount of solar energy captured through photosynthesis in the form of food. When we eat and digest this food, the solar energy it contains fuels human activities. Now, before what I refer to as the fossil fuel bonanza took place, the most universal human activity powered by food from crops was, in fact, growing next year's food from crops, right? Larger scale non-agricultural social endeavors like building pyramids or fighting wars or composing and performing operas required some social engineering, in which the farmer class of people worked extra hard and extra long hours to produce the food energy that allowed these other non-agricultural classes of people to exist without doing farm work. In fact, a dark side of pre-fossil fuel agriculture is that many societies coerced through slavery or other forms of subjugation groups of others, other classes, races, genders, to undertake the arduous work of farming so that much smaller groups of non-farmers could eat and do something else. But I would like to take a minute to ask the question, why is farming such hard work? It seems like a silly question, right? I mean, it just inherently is, right? It's hard. But why is it hard? What are we doing that makes it so hard? Oh. Okay, it's a plant. Well, the activity in farming that traditionally required the most work was clearing vegetation, first by clearing the wild perennial vegetation, and then weeding and weeding and weeding again to give the seeds and seedlings of the annual crops, wheat, barley, corn, chickpea, rice, millet, sorghum, a chance to grow. In nature, pretty much the only time that annual plants dominate ecosystems is after a dramatic disturbance, such as a catastrophic wildfire or severe flood or a landslide. The energy that is released in each of these forms of disturbance is remarkable and is sufficient to kill the diverse and dominant native perennial vegetation that characterizes forests, grassland, deserts, and savannas. Humans, with our big brains, chose that rare ecosystem of a highly disturbed piece of ground, clear cut of vegetation every year, as our food-producing ecosystem. So fortified by the energy in the food we grow for ourselves and our work animals, we have, for about 10,000 years to about 250 years ago, committed ourselves to a lifestyle of extraordinarily hard work, battling ecological succession with the plow, hoe, disc, or machete. And by ecological succession, I mean the strong tendency for ecosystems to grow back into a diverse perennial vegetative community. Okay, by ecological succession, I mean the strong tendency for ecosystems to grow back into a diverse perennial vegetative community. If I dare anthropomorphize, recently plowed fields really want to be something else, like a prairie or a forest. And nature has honed a heck of a process called succession that will, in fact, recreate prairies or forests. And it takes a lot of energy to keep that from happening. That is the work, stopping succession in its tracks, that defined our agricultural existence, indeed, arguably ourselves as a species, for the last 10,000 years. That is, until about 250 years ago, at least for those of us in industrialized parts of the world. It was at that time that we began to figure out how to stop ecological succession a new way. You got it. By employing fossil fuel energy, we can clear-cut the landscape down to bare soil every year without having to rely on food energy to guide plows and wield machetes day after day. Tractors of all sizes could do that work now. And agriculture's chapter of the fossil fuel bonanza does not stop there. We have figured out how to use fossil fuels to address virtually every other thing that limits crop growth, using fertilizers, organic and inorganic, pesticides, organic and inorganic, irrigation, season extension, plastic sheets for weed prevention, and so on. Many of these energy-expensive inputs are used to shore up a low-functioning plowed field, a field that has no roots for a good part of the year. And even in the Midwest US, with some of the best agricultural science in the world, grain agriculture continues to leak 50% of the nitrogen applied to the crop. So here's the deal. We went from near zero reliance on fossil fuels to grow an acre of grain when the Declaration of Independence was signed, to 99.96% reliance on fossil fuels to grow an acre of corn in Iowa today. 99.96% reliance on fossil fuels to grow an acre of corn today. That's the human energy input, or human-directed energy input. This overwhelming reliance on fossil fuels to produce our food is problematic. If we are serious about decarbonizing society this century, it seems to me that this degree of dependence must be addressed. And I'm cautiously optimistic that the work we are doing here and our colleagues are doing at over 50 institutions around the world may help, and not just a little. Here's the deal. If you create an agriculture that does not require huge energy expenditures to battle succession, an agriculture that is much more like the natural system that was in place before, then it will not require nearly as much energy to grow the same amount of food as our current annual systems require. And if you follow some other cues of natural systems, like integrating legumes for biological nitrogen fixation, even less human-sourced energy is required to maintain the agroecosystem. When it comes to the post-carbon future, it will be desirable, no matter what, to have an agriculture that does not require nearly as much work. And this is true regardless of whether you are a person who thinks we will come up with a bridge to renewable biofuels or solar electric, or whether you think the bottom's going to drop out of our technological society, leaving us to farm without machines. In either case, agroecosystems that function more like the rest of the Earth's terrestrial ecosystems will give humanity a little more slack, a little more wiggle room to sort out living within unfamiliar limits. And we may hear from Francesca Cotrufo tomorrow morning how converting ag land back into something that looks and functions more like natural systems that came before also means capturing a lot of the soil carbon that was lost when we converted the natural system to agriculture in the first place, thus helping to put the brakes on climate change. All right, that ends the sermon. Now, back to the work at hand. What you're about to hear are updates from a wide range of works in progress. And I usually like to start by trying to contextualize our work a little bit more ecologically every year. I think it is safe to say that every year each of us experiences amazement, frustration, curiosity, tedium, and more developed understanding of the transition we aim to see in agriculture across the globe. In the world of soil ecology, we're working on several fronts here at TLI and with colleagues at Colorado State University, University of Minnesota, and University of Kansas, some of whom are here, to evaluate soil carbon sequestration under perennial crops. We have continued to work on legume Kernza intercrops or bicultures. Alfalfa continues to lead the pack as the most compatible perennial legume in Kansas that holds promise to support the nitrogen requirements of Kernza. But one species of legume is not enough. Thus, our legume breeder, Brandon Schlautman, is working to diversify the menu of perennial legumes that could be intercropped with Kernza and other grains. He will talk shortly about trialing Cura clover, sainfoin, and others. But one more thing, before I turn it over to my colleagues, I want to acknowledge and thank the group that really makes this work happen. Rachel said it was us, but it's really the interns. And if you are an intern, please stand up and let yourself be known. Yeah. Incredible group, motivated, interested, and hardworking. So with that, I'd like to invite Tiffany Durr, the greenhouse manager, who has had a huge new facility added to her plate, to come and tell us how it's been. So Tiffany.
All right. Well, I want to start today off with one of my favorite quotes by President Theodore Roosevelt. He's one of my favorite presidents because he was the type of person that no matter what other people thought of him, he went forward what he thought was the right thing to do. And that sounds a lot like the people that I work with here at the Land Institute. So here it is. It's not the critic that counts, not the man who points at how strong man stumble or where the doer of deeds have done them better. The credit belongs to the man in the arena, whose face is marred with dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who knows the great enthusiasm and great devotion, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement and who, at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold, timid souls who have never known nor never will know neither victory nor defeat. So the reason I wanted to read that today is because each and every one of the people that you're about to hear from and that you have heard from already are in the arena. They're all fighting the good fight. Their faces are marred with dust and blood and sweat. And when they come in from the field, lots of sweat. And they literally are putting their blood, sweat, and tears into the research. That's one of the best things about being at the Land Institute. Each and every employee is daring greatly to accomplish what many have said could not be done. But we believe and we fight for what we know is right. We fight for crops that are rooted deeply but full of grain. We fight for crops that work together and grow together. We care so deeply about this work that we put our hearts and souls into it. This is something that our board of directors has recognized. Because we care so much, they have decided that the employees should quite literally have a seat at the table. The board of directors voted in May to have an employee seat on the board of directors. Yes, exactly. The Land Institute has always been on the forefront of progressive thought, and this is another amazing way that we are leading the way. So please, let's have a great round of applause for our board. And for those of you on the board, I wrote this before yesterday, just so you know. So here's my greenhouse update. Have you ever had one of those years and you think it can only go up from here? And then a year later, you're like, wait a minute, did it go up? That would kind of describe my last year with the new greenhouse. And luckily for you, my number one skill is positivity. And so no matter what happened, I was always able to put a positive spin on it. Otherwise, this talk could be quite different and unmotivating and maybe a little sad. So the north greenhouse, which is the old greenhouse, remains open, and both the Kernza and Perennial wheat projects were able to expand their programs this year after evicting the rest of the programs to banishing them to the new south greenhouse. You know how your first child is kind of the gold star child, and then and you think, oh yeah, I think I got this, I'm ready for a second one. And the second one comes along and you're deep in the middle of it and you're like, oh my goodness, this was a lot more work than I remembered. That's been the south greenhouse. So I missed my mark thinking the greenhouse would open in October and ended up opening in, we'll just say mid-November. And now we're using the term open loosely. As they were moving plants in, I was still trying to figure out why the watering system was not working, and finally realized that the pumps were hooked up to the wrong... never mind, we're not going to go negative in this talk. One of the most amazing positive notes is since we opened, we have grown 6,000 legumes, 9,000 silphium plants, 2,500 crop protection ecology plants, and 600 sorghum plants for a grand total of over 18,000 plants went through that new south greenhouse. So one of the scientists' new favorite features of this new greenhouse is that no matter where I am on Earth, they can text me and ask me to please water their benches. The jury's still out on whether or not that's my favorite feature. One of the fun things I found out is that when I went on my first vacation after building the greenhouse, is that the greenhouse can text me. So you can imagine my surprise when I take my phone out of airplane mode and I get this big burr, burr, burr alert on my phone that says, the greenhouse has lost its heartbeat. I only went to Atlanta. I should be able to leave greenhouse. Turns out the internet was down for a brief time, and it was okay after all. So I can safely say that this year has been a bit of a rough learning curve, but luckily I'm always up for a good challenge. So now let's chat about something I'm super excited about, which is my own research I've been doing here at the Land Institute this year. In the Land Institute greenhouse, we strive to be as organic as we possibly can be. And one year when I was trying to get rid of spider mites, I stumbled upon the use of essential oils. And there wasn't a lot of information when I first got started with them, but I could tell that they were super powerful and they were making a huge change in the way that I was going to continue to do pest management. And so I started doing little experiments, trying to figure out what would work best for which pests. When Ebony, our crop protection ecologist entomologist, started, I showed her what I was doing and how I'd come up with the recipes. After calling me the Martha Stewart from hell with my extermination cookbook, she said, "You know what you're doing could be published in a scientific paper." I mean, there must have been like crickets, because I had to have given her the most deer in the headlight look ever. So I managed to push past the panic, screaming and my screaming inner critic, and I managed to say, "Really? You think so? How do I even do that?" So together we designed a study using the essential oils to manage my arch enemy, the thrips. And we did a bioassay in small containers using clover leaves, and we got some incredible results. Thyme, arborvitae, Siberian fir, and peppermint seemed to do the best without causing any phototoxicity in the plants. So we stepped it up to whole plant assays. This was a little bit harder to figure out, but once we got it figured out, it was going quite smoothly. And the essential oils we have been testing have been performing very well, and even performing just as well, if not better, than the conventional pesticide that we were testing it against. So that gets me really excited about how much we can really help others in understanding how we don't necessarily have to depend on chemicals to run the greenhouse. Ebony knows my enthusiasm for spreading the word about how to use essential oils for pest management, and so she encouraged me to submit a proposal to present a poster at the American Society of Entomology in November. And I, again, gave her the deer in the headlights look, and I said, sure. And so it did get accepted, so I will get to present that in November. And thank you. I know that this is something that these guys over here do day in and day out, but for me, this was huge. I am the girl who in high school was told she would never go to college, and if she did, she would never graduate, by my high school guidance counselor, who refused to let me take college prep English. But my mom had always told me that from the day I was born that I was going to go to college and get the education she wished she would have been encouraged to do. And I really didn't know what else to do. Luckily, one of my good friends had overheard this counselor, grabbed my hand, dragged me into the hallway, told me 100% I was going to college, and helped me figure out a way around that pesky counselor to get into college prep English. Thank you. I was also told at my first college research job at a sorghum research station that I should never do research work because I'm dyslexic and I would just screw it up. So I'm just telling you all of this to say that there are lots of naysayers along the way when you're in the arena. And I'm sure each and every one, in fact, I know all of these scientists, had such hecklers on the sidelines, but still they rise and continue to fight, and for that, I admire them. So, thank you. So without further ado, and since I am out of time, I would like to welcome to the stage Shu Wen.
Good afternoon, everyone. Perennial wheat is a hybrid species produced by crossing annual wheat and perennial wheatgrass. Oh, louder. We make crosses in greenhouse. After plenty of seeds is available, we test, evaluate, select in the field. So far, some stabilizers have been obtained using for two types of perennial wheat. The first type of perennial wheat is produced by crossing bread wheat and intermediate wheatgrass. The plant carries about 40 chromosomes from annual wheat and 14 chromosomes from wheatgrass. We call this type of perennial wheat regular one. This year we did a replicated experiment in the field comparing 7 stable lines developed by our program with 4 breeding lines developed by other institutions and annual wheat cultivar. One of our latest breeding lines named B1107 had the highest grain yield, about 86% that of annual wheat. Also, this breeding line regrow very well, very consistently immediately after grain harvest. The results demonstrated that it's possible to improve both grain yield and perenniality simultaneously in a certain range. However, these regular perennial wheat lines are not true perennial in Kansas, just because a common issue called spring type regrowth. In the first year, the plant looks like a winter wheat, but in the second year, the plant looks like a spring wheat. So the plants cannot make through some stressed conditions such as summer heat, drought, or winter cold. But we did international trial several years ago. It showed that these regular perennial lines did better in regions with mild summer and mild winter. We will send these perennial lines developed by our program to those regions for further testing. For this spring type regrowth, we are working together with Oklahoma State University and Max Planck Institute for plant breeding in Germany, investigating several flowering time genes. Because in annual wheat, these flowering time genes has a memory of the cold winter. Through some experiments, we found that these genes most likely are the reason for spring type regrowth. Hopefully, we can get some good results in the coming years. The second type of perennial wheat is produced by crossing winter durum wheat and intermediate wheatgrass. This year, we grow thousands of plants in spaced rows in the field. They did excellently until at the end August. Before several floodings occurred. Compared, they are better than any existing a regular perennial with lines. They look more persistent. Also, they produce a very large grain. This year, we have only thousands of plants, so we got perhaps 50 pounds of seeds from these plants. Just last week, put a lot most of the seeds in the field. Next year, we will have hundreds of pounds of seeds for new round of international trial across the world. My report is over. Next, next is Brandon. Our legumes breeder. He graduated from University of Wisconsin and joined the land in 2016. Right? He's young and very innovative, bringing many new technologies.
Thank you, Xuan. Tim mentioned the rainfall that we've had earlier, and it's continuing now. And this has been a great opportunity for me, and I hope a few others, to go on kind of a soil erosion tour. It's been an amazing year. We've seen valley erosion, a type of water erosion here on the river, on the banks of the Smoky Hill, cutting out actually part of the Marty Bender Nature Area. We had to rebuild the trail. We've seen rill and sheet erosion on lots of farmer fields. We've even seen gully erosion, taking thousands of pounds of soil off of fertile farmland and depositing it elsewhere. For me, one of the most interesting erosion events I've seen, some of you have heard of the minimum till technique, strip tillage. So we have some corn growers south of here, they have strip tiller rigs where they till just maybe a 5 or 6 inch area, a little bit deep, and put nitrogen in there right before they plant corn. And they use this RTK GPS technology to do it perfectly straight in the field. And so there's fields south of us that are ephemeral gullies forming like perfectly RTK straight lines. It's been amazing, and I think the finale of my soil erosion tour this year, Aubrey and I in January went to Palestine, which was really amazing and really contextualized the importance of our work here for continuously living deep roots, holding the soil. And there we saw the effects of erosion over a 10,000-year period of tillage in agriculture, which ultimately leads to sand, bare rock, desert, and a landscape that can not only not feed the people that occupy it any longer, but can no longer even support the native plant life that was there before the people came. And one of the other things I did this year was read this book, Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture, and Wes actually referred to it earlier this morning, and it was a book that inspired him, and it's been inspiring me. In the book, he names the problem of erosion and also names a solution, which is to create an institute called not the Land Institute, but the Mountain Institute. And quote, the work of that institute would be to start a vast work that is nothing less than the deliberate creation of a whole new set of crop trees, and then to make a new permanent agriculture based on these new crop trees. And this is where we need to thank Wes Jackson, and I guess not necessarily Wes, but Laura Jackson, for not only naming the problem of soil loss and erosion and a solution of permanent agriculture based on perennial herbaceous grains grown in polycultures, but also, and most importantly, having the initiative to will this solution into existence by founding the Land Institute more than 40 years ago. So thank you, Wes, for starting to make it happen. The book goes on to describe what such an institute would take and need and do. And it says, quote, an institute could employ the full time of a man, of 10 men, of 100 men, of 500 men. After it really got underway, it might enjoy as many men as it takes to man and operate a battleship. That is to say, the money required to build, maintain, and operate one. But what millions of acres might be saved? I'm the legume breeder, part of the legume team here at the Land Institute. Currently, we don't have 500 men, and we don't have a budget to operate a battleship. But the three of us, Abby Hahn is here, I think, and Spencer. We've been trying to do with a modest budget about what 6 people can do. We've been accomplishing about what 3 people can do, I think. Most of our work's been focusing on legume, intermediate wheatgrass, or Kernza intercrops, specifically alfalfa, like Tim mentioned. We're really excited about the opportunity to grow Kernza on a lot of acres, especially in what we're calling these dual-purpose forage and grain systems, where we're producing a human grain for humans, and we're producing leaves and stems and forage for livestock. One way to supply some of Kernza's nitrogen needs is with legume for fixation, but legumes, especially alfalfa, are really high-quality forage for animals. In Kansas, alfalfa seems to be a great companion with intermediate wheatgrass. It's an excellent nitrogen fixer, and then most importantly, it's a crop that farmers in the area are really familiar with. They grow. It's something that they're confident in. We've been directing a project for 2 years now, collaborating with other researchers from Wisconsin and Minnesota, with grant funding from SARE and the National Alfalfa and Forage Alliance to study how specific alfalfa varieties and specific alfalfa morphologies and physiologies affect the compatibility of and productivity of these Kernza alfalfa intercrops. In addition to that, we're studying all sorts of other things. We're looking at row spacing and population density. How many rows of alfalfa do we need for the most productive Kernza grain crop that we can have? We're studying things, we're looking at nitrogen fertility. How much of the nitrogen does alfalfa supply? Does it meet the requirements of intermediate wheatgrass? And then, like Tim said, we just planted a big experiment, and I could use some help trying to figure out a name for it. It's kind of a mega experiment. We planted many different varieties of alfalfa, many different varieties of multiple species of clovers, sainfoin, some milk vetches, and et cetera. And it's probably way bigger than we should have done and could handle collecting data from. But it's going to be exciting to see if there's things that we're missing out on besides alfalfa. We've also been working with Kansas growers to try to start establishing these intermediate wheatgrass alfalfa intercrops. And there are now currently 157 acres of Kernza alfalfa intercrop farmer fields spread across 3 different counties in Kansas. Some of them have been successful, some of them have not, and there's still a lot to learn, and I think this is going to be the case with polycultures in general. As we add more species, there's more interactions between the varieties of the 2 species, interactions with the environment and the conditions of the place, and so there's a lot to learn. On that note, an especially exciting project that just began this fall through another SARE grant to the University of Minnesota, Land Institute, and the University of Wisconsin is some on-farm Kernza plus legume intercropping research. In the last month, Kernza and alfalfa and other legume intercrops have been established on 2 farms each in Kansas, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, and also on a research station in Nebraska with the intention of creating a network of growers that can work together to help each other and to help us learn to produce Kernza grain in polycultures in ways that are economically and ecologically successful. I don't know the exact acreage, but there are other Kernza legume farmer fields and research trials in other places, 9 states in total. There's trials in Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, Colorado, Montana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, and New York. And in addition, there's international trials. There's trials in Canada, Europe, Australia, and elsewhere. Lastly, I want to mention that we started a big push, planning multiple trials this fall, working towards the development of a new perennial grain legume crop. We're sort of heading in and deciding to work on sainfoin, it's Onobricus vicifolia. It's a really drought-tolerant perennial forage legume. People in the U.S., Montana, Wyoming, have used it to feed cattle and graze cattle for a long time. It's really fascinating. There's a seed production industry already, and I've been learning from some of the growers up there. There's some feeding trials that have been done recently showing that pigs and chickens that eat sainfoin grain do about the same as when they're fed soybean meal. There's no developmental abnormalities for those animals. And they have monogastric systems just like us, and it suggests that we can probably eat it and consume it as well. I'm really looking forward to finding collaborators to work with, domesticating sainfoin as a human edible grain crop. I'm especially interested if you are a food scientist or if you work at a company like Impossible Meats or Beyond Meat, looking at the protein extrusion properties of sainfoin, the protein qualities, as well as other nutritional qualities of the plant and of the seed. Yeah, please see me if you are interested in any way in sainfoin. And finally, we're doing plot tours here in a little bit, but I'm also going to be afterwards from 6:45 to 7:15. We have some trials on the East Bank that are Kern's alfalfa intercropping trials, and I'll be there if anyone wants to come ask questions. It's just across the north across Waterwell Road and then down the Wahub Trail, and I'll be there. So thank you guys. And also, there's a research resident poster session later, and Abby Hahn is the research resident for the legume program, and she'll be talking about some of the Cura clover research that she's doing. Now I'd like to introduce Catherine Turner. She's our crop protection geneticist here at the Land Institute. She'll be giving us a research update.
So thanks, Brandon. The crop protection genetics program, which kind of protects all the crops that are being bred from diseases, has just finished its second field season, and we're still learning a lot. So personally and professionally, this has been a year dominated by moisture and disease. Since my first child was born in February, our house has been layered with spit up and milk. And while the floors, burp cloths, and diapers at home were getting doused, so were the fields. It was too wet for my alfalfa plantings to establish last winter, and it was too wet to walk in the fields for much of the summer. We had a lot of interns who went barefoot because the mud boots kept getting stuck in the fields. So that moisture brought waves of disease over the growing season, not unlike the disease hitting our home now that we have a daughter who started daycare. So as many of you know what it's like to have a new kiddo at home, I'll tell you more about our fields here at TLI. So the high rainfall this spring prompted a lot of disease in the research plots. In perennial wheat, we saw a lot of head blight infection, which is a fungal disease that produces toxin in the grain. We tested 7 of the candidate perennial wheat varieties that Schuen's developing in the disease nursery. This nursery has all the things that are needed for young developing pathogens. It has a protected habitat with lots of food, which includes our crops, and water with sprinklers that mist for every hour all night long. So as the uniform blanket of disease engulfed the perennial wheat, we determined which lines can resist that infection even under kind of ideal and perfect conditions. Of the 7 perennial wheat lines, we found only 1 that was unable to resist disease. The other 6 had much lower infection. So the next step is going to be to send that grain to North Dakota for collaborators to test for toxin analysis. So Kernza can also be infected by that same fungal pathogen that causes head blight. And for the second year, it was kept in the disease nursery. But even under pretty ideal conditions, we only see a few plants that have high infection. And we've been kind of surprised that occasionally in other fields, growers will find high toxin levels in the grain. And so we think with the abnormally high rainfall in Salina this year, we can test a theory that may be due to the contact with the soil. So during the heavy rainfalls, it can push the plants to lay flat on the soil and have contact with the ground and more fungal spores, as well as when the stalks are harvested and laid to rest on the ground for a few days to dry. That may be when the infection happens, but because we've had so much rainfall this year, we can actually test that. So in December, I moved the first silphium and wheatgrass plants into the new crop protection wing of the greenhouse and began setting up the lab space. Since then, we've been acquiring a lot of new equipment setting up chambers where the plants and hopefully only the pathogens that we want will grow. We also installed a large high-pressure heated autoclave where we can sterilize pots after we're done with experiments with pathogens, and for sanitation to contain diseases when we have outbreaks in the greenhouses, which we had one for lupins this year. We're still learning how to avoid alarms, and have been through a lot of electrical and plumbing hurdles in the new greenhouse. But at the moment, everything's working, and we're running successful experiments. So in those new growth chambers, Angela, who's one of the interns here for the summer and dedicated to just the crop protection genetics program, has made a really interesting observation about a rust disease that affects silphium. So this rust reduces the head number and the head weight and the overall productivity of the silphium plants. And we're trying to develop a process so that we can infect the plants in the greenhouse and select the ones that can resist infection so that we can use breeding to improve those populations. In the past, we've been unsuccessful in trying to infect the seedlings when using our old facilities because we didn't have the ability to control temperature and humidity and light in the shared space. And we were also kind of concerned about infecting the wrong plants and inadvertently killing important breeding germplasm. So at the end of May, we set up a new experiment and looking at active infection on living plants that were taken from the field. And after a week of placing the plants in the growth chambers, the pathogen had germinated and to the infectious stage of the pathogen, the spore stage. And it coincided with the plants also dropping clusters of these black spores on the bottom of the chamber. So that kind of observation isn't something that is known in other rust diseases, and we think it's going to be very important for producing the disease infection in the next year, not something that we could easily observe in the field. So we're now working to understand what the optimal temperature and humidity are for the requirements of timing to inoculate with that disease so that we can infect the plants and within a few weeks, instead of 1 or 2 years, figure out which ones can resist infection. David and I have started to work to determine the cause of a strange, possibly viral symptom of silphium. The symptom seems to kind of suck the life from the plants, making the veins clear and distorting the leaves and the stalk into a wirely kind of twisted swirl. It prevents certain fields, especially if waterlogged, from making flowers. And in other fields, the symptoms have spread kind of slowly from 1 or 2 plants. And it takes maybe several years for the field to become more infected. And we've started looking for disease in the native areas as well. But we see this kind of symptom in all of the native prairies. So we've tested for every virus that we can think of that might be a good candidate. We've checked more than 20 viruses so far for sunflower, geranium, lettuce, and ornamental flowers. But we haven't found anything. They've all come back negative. So based on conversations with virologists at the Phytopathological Society and our colleague at Kansas State University, Shahida Nouri, we've decided to try a sequencing approach to identify this virus because it's probably very specific just to silphium. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for results to come back from that, Angela has set up an experiment to try to transfer the virus from one plant to another. And we're also waiting infection on that, but it may require a special insect or even a fungus to spread that virus between plants. So this year we focused on identifying pathogens that cause the most severe diseases from last year's field season, and have expanded our sampling to also include viruses, which we think would be particularly important in perennial crops where they could live for many years. Colleagues at Kansas State University have been very helpful and identifying the pathogens responsible for disease outbreaks. And while I spent most of February and March on parental leave after my daughter was born, 2 days after that, Eric Cassetta, who's one of the research residents, returned to work with us and has been working on a project led by Jim Beaver at the University of Kansas. So his project will be displayed on the posters outside, just in the hut across the way. But he's looking at the above ground disease symptoms to test kind of an idea that plants are more diverse and better defended in the eastern regions with higher annual rainfall. We expect this project will provide new directions for where to look for new variation in disease resistance and for silphium that's more broadly adapted. So I want to thank a few people. I'm very grateful to Sydney, who's David's technician on the silphium project, and to David for helping me keep research projects on track while I was out on maternity leave. And I want to thank the whole TLI community for their support of my family. They visited, brought meals, and also improved the parental leave policy. So it's a good thing. So it's made me very proud to be part of this community and very happy to work with these exceptional colleagues. So we're slowly making progress to identify some of the significant diseases and breeding crops to be able to withstand infection. But the effort has to be a lot larger to involve more researchers to help identify the diseases and then to breed the crops in different environments where we haven't grown them before. And to work with farmers and agronomists who can offer more strategies to control the disease. So very grateful to you all for your support and look forward to talking with you more this afternoon. So thanks. Next up is David Van Tassel, who's the silphium breeder.
I'd like to interrupt this programming for a brief message from the regulator. Turn your cell phones to silent, please. Thank you.
So in the past, I've talked to you about roots and water and caterpillars and chromosomes. And today, you've had a preview. I had to decide whether to talk about plant viruses or humans. Now, maybe this seems like an easy choice. Where's the joy in discussing selfish plant parasites that contribute nothing to the ecosystem? But frankly, viruses really aren't much better. And there's the problem that I don't think of myself as a people person. I was a shy, quiet child who enjoyed plants more than people. And my own mother worried about how I would navigate this harsh world. She came up with a brilliant solution for me. She knew that plants brought me joy and that biology was my favorite subject, so I was going to become a dentist. And I could have the waiting room filled with my favorite potted plants. But best of all, she said, my hands would be in my patients' mouths so I wouldn't have to chit-chat with them. That's a true story. And later I realized that there's no Hollywood script in which the silent dentist obsessed with exotic plants doesn't turn out to be an organ thief or a serial killer. But in her defense, my mother never went to a movie theater in her whole life, so she didn't know that. So I'm trying to explain my reluctance to focus on humans and human stuff like relationships and emotions. Another thing is that scientists are supposed to be dispassionate and detached from their subjects. But I can't escape that people have become a much bigger part of my professional life in the last couple of years. It's not that introverts like me are antisocial. Maybe we're just slow social, kind of like slow food versus fast food. When I first started at the Land Institute, one of the best things about the job was working with interns who were here for 10 months. Plenty of time to form real relationships. Not long afterwards, we switched to summer internships, and we still get truly exceptional folks thanks to Tim's recruiting efforts. But inevitably, my first real conversations with an intern happen 1 week or less before they head back to college. It's sad and disappointing for a slow social person like myself. So a couple of years ago, Tim let me experiment with an extreme internship that lasted 18 months. I could say a lot of things about that time, but here's a signal snapshot. I hate conferences, but I thought it was important for my intern to present her research. So we went together to the National Botany meeting, and I realized just how natural it felt. I had been a scientist for decades and never had a student or a protege, never taken students to a meeting. Now that is very unnatural. A very human thing about science is passing the torch. So I'll sum up that whole 18-month experience by the title of one of my dad's favorite books that I never read, called Surprised by Joy. Part of that joy came from another deepening relationship. My Argentinian colleague sent me photos of her silphium seedlings by WhatsApp. And so a day later, I read this message. David Van Tassel, why have you not told me how beautiful my seedlings are? At that moment, I realized that she and I shared not only an interest in science and the idea of domestication, but an emotional human connection with a particular plant species. At that time, despite having a number of excellent research collaborators, I believed that I was the only person on the planet who felt affection for silphium. Knowing that there were 3 of us changed everything. Silphium gave each of us joy, and there was joy in sharing that. So somehow Tim and Fred carved out space in our budget for us to expand this extended internship. And I'm pleased to say what other people have hinted at here, that we currently have 4 research residents. One is a young artist, and the others are young geneticists and agroecologists. You need to meet them, and you need to go see their posters. As has been mentioned, they're right behind us here. And Brandon and I will be taking them and some of the younger technicians to the National Agronomy meetings in San Antonio in November. And other things that we do with them include Aubrey organizing important discussions and training sessions. So I know that scientists are supposed to be motivated by the joy of discovery and the joy of data and number crunching. But I'll tell you that the highlights of my days this year have been my interactions with the interns, residents, and the young technicians, including Sydney, who joined the Perennial Oilseeds program this January after finishing a master's degree at the University of Minnesota studying silphium. Last Prairie Festival, I had entered a 5-month period without a technician, residents, or visiting Argentinians. When Sydney and the residents showed up this winter, I realized just how social the process of science is, at least for me. Science is fueled by funding and brain power and luck, but also by human relationships, by affection, loyalty, and mutual care. Of course, I get some of that from my long-term colleagues, but the truth is that often we say hi to each other in the morning and then immediately all scatter to our own plots, our own species, our own crops. So it can be a little bit isolated for each of us. So you can probably see this theme of people, some other people stuff this year. As Catherine mentioned, several of us got to be part of a big, interesting project at the University of Kansas. It's been fun and new for me to work with folks from several disciplines and campuses, and it provided the perfect framework for several research resident projects. And if you go look at their posters or walk the Marty Bender Trail, you'll get a better idea about that project. Catherine and Ebony both have silphium projects, and that's been a game changer. Another thing, we had about 30 people here in July for a silphium research conference, and that wouldn't have happened 5 years ago. Aubrey and I somewhat compulsively started sending out silphium seedlings to be planted around the country in people's backyards, farms, or community gardens. I wanted to make sense of the bewildering way that silphium does great in unexpected places, for example, downtown St. Louis, Argentina, and Vermont, and falls apart in other places. The joy people have expressed at being included in our research and the psychological boost that gave us has been a wonderful surprise. Last year, when I was standing up here, I said that it had been the best of times and the worst of times. That is still true. But the best has been the people stuff. I'm not sure that I would have stuck it out without my silphium sisters. I'm not joking. The great news is that affection, like viruses, can spread. And we are much more than 3 now of people who care about silphium. And I was bound and determined to get back to viruses, in case you didn't notice that. So this touchy-feely stuff is good for the resilience of my program, but working with young researchers and artists and international collaborators and citizen scientists has made me more productive and has improved the quality and depth of our research. So I beg you to help us find funding to sustain and expand the research resident and civic science programs. If you know of people or foundations with special interests in STEM and community engagement and career development, please let me or Amy know. So I focused this talk on my direct experiences with how slow human relationship building, affection, and mutual care sustain, accelerate, and enrich my research. Not all scientists would agree, and certainly the robotic plant breeders of 2029 won't need this emotional fuel. I truly hope that the educational and outreach work I've described doesn't just help me. It's easy to argue that long-term research requires us to train and engage future researchers and the public. But please ask our residents for their honest feedback. Has this program helped them develop professionally? Does it make them more interested in building a career related to the Land Institute's work? And at the macro level, we could discuss how our scientific work is inevitably influenced by social arrangements or needs new social relationships to succeed. I will leave that to someone much more qualified, my colleague and co-conspirator, Aubrey, who is up in a minute. She's the director of ecospheric studies and the source of many important new ideas about human domestication. I have sprinkled unscientific terms like joy throughout this talk. And if I was a braver person, I'd include another forbidden word. But for now, let me just hint that in 100 years, scholars may come to the conclusion that this thing I'm talking about wasn't actually needed to make Subarus, but it did make silphium a silphium.
Thank you, David. And thanks to all of you who are here with us today, and to the many, many more people who are contributing in so many diverse ways to our collective work. So I direct the Ecosphere Studies program. Ecosphere Studies arguably studies everything, but I'll narrow that down a little bit, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of particular projects from 2019 here. So in Ecosphere Studies, what we're working toward are reorienting the way that people think and feel about the Earth, reconnecting human relationships to ecosystems, and we're doing this in order to allow our species to cope with our immediate problems, and at the same time, we hope, reshape societies to ensure an enduring human future. We seek to make possible a just transition toward perennial agricultural economies in which human communities live within the energetic limits of our ecosphere. Ambitious, long-term, here's going to be a short update. one of the things that David talked about that I want to begin with is how we're beginning to create new projects interwoven with the crucial efforts in natural systems agriculture being advanced by all of my colleagues here in research and commercialization. So this summer, the Perennial Oilseeds Program and the Ecosphere Studies Program collaborated to send out silphium seedlings impulsively but very intentionally to 40 excited people who have been growing and tending these plants in 18 states across the country. Participants in our civic science community have been sharing scientific data and measurements with us, as well as practical feedback on our pilot project design. We are learning together how to organize a community to gather information about how silphium responds to multiple growing environments, including the pollinators and pests and pathogens in those places. And we think such information will be helpful for silphium breeding in terms of broad adaptation. But our civic science collaborators, and we do think of this community and have designed it to facilitate collaboration, not an extractive relationship where we're sort of farming out work, but where people are joining with us in a collaborative approach to co-produce this knowledge. And these collaborators are sharing their experiences with caring for silphium. They have to water and weed and observe the plants. They explain the silphium project to their friends and family and neighbors. They send in photographs, they exchange emails, questions, and ideas. And in monthly surveys, we ask questions about their choices and their reflections, so we can understand if and how this repetitive, modest, hands-on, ongoing, maybe unending care work shapes their learning and understanding. Most of these pilot project participants were already familiar with the Land Institute and were strongly motivated to join the project. We had a lot more interest than we could even contain in this pilot community. So you can see why we're excited about designing a larger scale version of this. And they were strongly motivated to join because of their interest in perennial agriculture and in native pollinator-friendly plants. A majority said they want to participate and contribute to authentic research. They're concerned about the future availability of food and soil, and they want to contribute to transformative, positive change in agriculture. They actually want to do this work with us, not just learn about it or hear about it. I hope they want to donate it to it too, but they want to do it with us. So our questions are, will their motivations persist over time? Will they develop stronger emotional attachments to just their particular silphium plants or to plants more broadly? Will their understanding of threshold concepts in ecological agriculture, such as perenniality and diversity, deepen? Will their direct and active involvement in research matter for their own mindsets beyond the fate of the seedlings they care for? Will their experiences and the educational materials that we provide help them perceive silphium as a beautiful, native, ornamental garden plant? Or will they learn to socially and commercially value silphium and see it as a next-generation food crop with ecological benefits? And if any of these changes in people happen, how will we know? And how will we know why? Answering these questions involves research methods from the arts, the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences, and it really invites an integrated and transdisciplinary approach. Though it will be challenging, we are excited as we undertake this community-based work. We need to learn if and how involving a broad representation of people matters. And by broad representation, I want to specifically name groups and regions whose ways of knowing are often undervalued and who are often disconnected from scientific research. We want to know how involving this broad and accurate representation of people early and deeply in a domestication process may increase the rate and quality of that domestication. So the idea that David mentioned around human domestication and the work that I've been really compelled by recently and I'm excited to dig into is this. that we can know from the history of domestication that people and plants change together, and they together change landscapes. So people and plants together is what we are thinking about here. Brandon mentioned how this past winter he and I made a trip to the West Bank in Palestine to visit our collaborator Omar Tezdel and the Makaneyat Research Collective there. We visited the cave and valley where some of the earliest evidence of human domestication of wheat was found millennia ago. And we met some of the women farmers who continue to plant wheat and save its seeds today. We saw the impacts of thousands of years of agriculture there on the land and on people, the soils lost, and the struggles between societies. How people feed themselves, how we eat, shapes our social arrangements and cultural practices. Agriculture shapes our relationship to this larger living planet that we're embedded within and the dynamic soil communities we are utterly dependent upon. So in an ecospheric perspective, agriculture is not just out there in fields and environments and research plots that are separate from us. But agriculture is also in here, in our bodies, in this barn, in the breaths that we take, in the metabolic processes that are keeping us awake and attentive right now, in the words and stories and norms and values that we use to think and feel and communicate. So this means changing agriculture is powerful. New crops open new possibilities, both ecologically and socially. But I also want to underscore that positive change in people's behavior is not inevitable with changing plants. People and plants change together, but if we have a good and just direction for that change, we cannot hope that it will simply happen on its own. We have to recognize how human community behavior is both socially constructed and biologically evolved, and in both cases shaped by our access to energy. Humans are land animals who live in relationship with biophysical and ecological processes, and humans are social creatures here in community who live in relationship to each other. To transform agriculture, we have to attend to both people and plants. In Palestine and in our continued collaboration with the Makaneyat team, we saw and continue to see what remains present. There is still biodiversity and beauty on those landscape hills and valleys, and creativity and curiosity and generosity among the people. For now, there are still perennial tree crops like olives and knowledge of wild food plants and spiced legumes sold as street snacks. There are still terraces holding on to soil, and in some of those hillside terraces in Judur Arboretum outside of Ramallah, there are small research plots with potential new crops for Palestine, including perennial crops that Land Institute researchers are working on here in the States. Such a persistent food culture may help the Makaneyat team and their collaborators build new perennial agroecosystems through community-based domestication efforts. So if the ecological future of agriculture is to become perennial and diverse, what is required of us in social terms? This is what I've come to understand as a fundamental question of the Land Institute's Ecosphere Studies work dating back to 2015, when Wes Jackson convened the first conference here in this barn with people talking here on this stage about how the invention of new perennial grain crops grown in mixtures requires new ways of thinking and making a living within the ecosphere. Since then, we've regularly designed events to bring together researchers and teachers and students and community members to do this work of co-producing and testing intergenerational approaches to learning and, I think, unlearning. There are truths that we have to remember. There are realities that we have to accept. There are some paths that we have to give up. And there are feelings of grief and pain and anger that we have to experience instead of deny. And still, there is the wondrous fact that we are alive now and have the opportunity to learn something completely new by doing this work for which we do not know the outcome. Maybe it's just the teacher and writer in me who is so drawn to imaginative possibility. I know that nothing is guaranteed, but I think it is truly wondrous that we now have the chance as people to be courageous. Since summer 2018, our Ecosphere Studies program has designed and facilitated 7 different workshops and short courses and symposia in Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa to investigate experiential learning. Most of these events were collaborations, and our partners ranged in age and background and discipline, across history and geography to psychology to farmers and ranchers and activists and artists. We think that weekend workshops like this Prairie Festival weekend can be entry points and pivot points and points of affirmation in the journeys home that we're trying to make. But we also think that we need more and deeper and ongoing learning hubs and research clusters of innovation and integration. So I'm looking forward to experimenting with that work in the coming year and building new collaborations. I want to end with the thought that it may be that only a just and caring society that accepts limits will sustain itself long enough to bring perennial polycultures into production. If so, then I am grateful to be part of a research community here and beyond, a community of people who are learning to live into and embody that future society from the ground up. Thank you for being part of that with us here. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Ebony Morell, the lead scientist for crop protection ecology and the recently crowned winner of the Land Institute's first Great Land Institute Bake Off.
Thank you, Aubrey. For your typical person starting out in a new position, you might argue that it is impossible to go anywhere but up. For example, when a plant breeder domesticates a new crop where there was none before, or when Aubrey creates entire education programs out of nothing. But when you're in the field of crop protection and you purposefully go about rearing entire colonies of pests and sticking caterpillars on otherwise perfectly healthy plants, at that point the definition of up gets a little hairy. In all seriousness, though, I am very pleased with what the Crop Protection Ecology Lab has accomplished in the past year. Eddie Charamond, the CPE technician, has devoted much of the past year to learning the life cycle of Eucosma giganteana, Eucosma for short, the major specialist pest of our Silphium plants. I was skeptical when Eddie told me he thought he could rear Eucosma in the laboratory within 1 year. But thanks to his diligence, he was able to do exactly that. Rear Eucosma from caterpillars to adults on a blend of Silphium plants and artificial diet. With the work Eddie has done, we are now several steps closer to understanding the life cycle of this pest, and this will help us to develop new methods to manage this pest in the field. So thank you, Eddie, for your hard work and your perseverance. I would also like to congratulate Alex Griffin, our research resident, for her tremendous capacity for troubleshooting in science. She has taken on several rather complicated projects, one of which is investigating how Silphium plants from different parts of the country and of different lineages change in their ability to take up beneficial fungi called arbuscular mycorrhizae. I don't know what prompted her to leave New York City and travel out to the middle of Kansas to spend hours measuring plant leaves, boiling roots, and staring through a microscope to count tiny fungal structures. But I am very glad she decided to do so, and I'm immensely proud of the work she has done. For more details on Alex's work, I encourage you, as many have already, to visit the Research Residence poster session this afternoon, where she can explain the project herself and in much greater detail than I have time to disclose here. I'm excited to point out our newest member of the team, our postdoctoral associate, Dr. Chase Stratton. So Chase is a Virginia native who moved north to earn his doctorate degree at the University of Vermont. I was heartened to hear this during his interview because at that point I knew he would be able to handle Kansas weather. Beyond his tolerance for temperature extremes, Chase came to us with a wealth of knowledge in chemical ecology, particularly the characterization of plant chemicals and use of essential oils to deter pests. So now Tiffany has a partner in crime. Yet another one. Since his arrival in June, he has conducted research in perennial sorghum, studying how fertilization and mycorrhizal fungi can help to boost sorghum's defenses against insect pests. Chase will be discussing some of his research further during the tours this afternoon. I would like to thank the Perennial Sorghum Lab, the Perennial Wheat Lab, and Adam for their assistance this year in managing chinch bugs at the landscape level. Thanks to group planning and cooperation, we were able to plant the sorghum and wheat fields apart from one another and plant the spaces in between them with diverse cover crop mixtures. These practices help to reduce movement of chinch bugs from the wheat fields to the sorghum fields, where they have done tremendous damage in the past. I look forward to continuing this collaboration in future years so that we can continue to keep chinch bug damage at bay. I would also like to thank Megan and Fiona of the sorghum team for their assistance in pest spotting this year. For the second year in a row, we had a late season visit from a pest called sorghum midge, a tiny fly which colonizes developing sorghum seeds and destroys seed heads. Until last year, this was not even considered a pest in central Kansas. Now, thanks to climate change, it appears to be here to stay. Fortunately, Megan and Fiona spotted this fly early enough this year that we were able to keep the sorghum midge from damaging many of Stan's most valuable plants. I'm extremely proud of the work the Crop Protection Ecology Lab has done, and the progress we have made in the past year has been important and necessary. But science is not always successful. For me, the story to this other side of the coin begins at night, standing alone in a silphium field. As I mentioned before, silphium has a specialist pest, the Eucosma moth. These moths lay their eggs onto the silphium flowers, and their caterpillars consume the flowers and oil seeds. For the past 6 years, Eucosma has been so abundant, it has destroyed David's breeding plots at TLI. Since moths fly at night, I donned my headlamp and went out after dark, walking through the silphium fields in search of this pest. A flowering silphium field by day is not only beautiful, but it's alive with insect activity, especially with pollinators like bees and butterflies. I was surprised to find that at night the pollinators are still there. They curl up and sleep on the flower heads, native bees of all types, despite the presence of predators. Rather than return to their hives or holes, they make their bed on these flowers to take advantage of the pollen shed the next morning, to feed themselves and to harvest food for the next generation. I looked upon this sight and I marveled at the ecological benefits this native oilseed crop provides. The next month, well before the plants were ready for harvest, I climbed into a tractor and mowed 6 of those silphium plots down. 3 of them were experimental plots for David's breeding program. I did this because I had to. Despite our best efforts to manage the Eucosma, by August, their caterpillars had colonized 60% of our flowers. If I had let those flowers mature, the caterpillars would have burrowed into the root crowns in the fall and fed there all winter. They would emerge the next year, and once again, our silphium harvest would be destroyed. At least by mowing this year's flowers, I could reduce the Eucosma and give the plants a better chance next year. But I had wanted to protect the plants this year too, and I had failed. Raina Dietrichs, our research resident and our featured artist at this year's Prairie Festival, was one of the people to come with me to the silphium fields one night and witness the sleeping bees. I admire Raina's art and her philosophical approach to art. As I have in my science, so has Raina also encountered unexpected occurrences in her art. Clay work she has designed is dried and cracked in the sun. Animals and people mar her intricate soil tapestries. But Raina doesn't view these flaws as mistakes or failures. She considers them a part of the artwork itself and embraces the changes they wreak, even as they obscure the design she labored so intensively to create. From this confluence of accident and design arises a new work of art, unintended, but with a purpose and beauty of its own. As I looked at the silphium stalks I had just destroyed, I thought of Raina. Then I grabbed a paper bag and walked through the field, filling it with whatever leftover oil seeds I could find. Earlier this summer, David invented a recipe for tofu made from silphium seeds. He did, and it's delicious. He and an intern, Sienna Polk, had worked on the recipe, and I decided I would try my hand at it too. Using what I had collected, I learned to thresh and clean seeds, soak and strain them, blend and boil, press and chill. I was able to produce about a pound of silphium tofu, which I cooked and served to our staff during the Perennial Week cook-off this year. Though the journey to get there was what I neither hoped nor intended, I was at least able to use silphium for the purpose David has spent years domesticating it, to feed people. Through both the ups and downs, I am grateful for the team that we have built, the colleagues we work with, and the people like you who support us from afar. I thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to reporting greater progress next year. For our next speakers, I am pleased to introduce Fiona Nabukalu, Sorghum Research Associate and Midge Spotter Extraordinaire, and the Sorghum Socialist and Director of Plant Parenthood, Stan Cox.
All right, I'll start off and then Stan will join me afterwards. So, overall, it's been a great year. We've had a lot of milestones, but the biggest highlight, and that's what I'll focus on, has been the development of rhizomatous diploid sorghum lines. So we believe that this is going to make development of perennial grain sorghum very easy. I'll let you know why this is really exciting to the sorghum breeding program. So just as a reminder, in developing perennial grain sorghum, we cross-cultivated sorghum with its perennial relative, Sorghum halepense, that's also popularly known as Johnson grass. So while cultivated sorghum is diploid, it has 20 chromosomes, the perennial parent we use is a tetraploid with 40 chromosomes. I can assure you that you're making a cross between a 20 chromosome species and a 40 chromosome species is very, very tricky and cumbersome. We've had several approaches to overcome this problem, and one of the methods that we've been using is to use synthetically induced tetraploids of cultivated sorghum. In other words, cultivated sorghum, the chromosomes of cultivated sorghum have been doubled to make it a tetraploid, in that it becomes very easy for you to make a cross with tetraploid perennial sorghum. Sorry. So we have a few of such existing lines. I mean, these have been developed by other institutes. We've tried to do it here in the past, to develop our own tetraploid cultivated sorghum, but so far we've not been so successful. It's still an ongoing experiment, but we are still working towards it. So for you to develop tetraploid sorghum, we use a chemical called colchicine, which is extracted from a lily plant. Some of you may know this chemical is toxic. It's carcinogenic and very nasty. But if you use precaution, you can double the chromosomes of cultivated sorghum, and then it becomes easy for you to cross with perennial sorghum. However, getting the tetraploids is not always guaranteed, and this explains why we only have a few existing tetraploid cultivated sorghum breeding lines that are available to us breeders. The second method that we use is to use genetic male sterility. This method is very common in hybrid seed production. I won't go so much into the details of how this works, but during meiosis, they produce unreduced gametes that can easily cross with the gametes of perennial sorghum. However, we still have limited number of genetic male sterile lines that we use in our breeding work. And as you may know, the breeders, we always need a broad spectrum of genetic diversity in our breeding programs. So much as we've been successful in developing perennial sorghum using the two above-mentioned approaches, the hybrids and their offsprings have always been tetraploids with 40 chromosomes. We've been limited in what we can cross perennial sorghum with. We just cannot introduce perenniality in any cultivated sorghum lines that we have. So our colleagues in Africa and other areas and the other collaborators that we work with have always been very excited about the perennial grain sorghum. But the problem is that it's not very easy to make crosses between perennial sorghum and our cultivated sorghum. So much as they would want to introduce perenniality in their locally existing adapted cultivated sorghum, it's not always easy for them. So getting back to our excitement, last year, by chance or by, should I say, a fluke in the sorghum reproductive system, we've obtained sorghum lines that are diploid and rhizomatous. So that makes it very easy to cross perennial sorghum with other cultivated sorghum lines. So we may not necessarily have to go through other approaches in developing perennial sorghum, but we just need to make a direct cross between cultivated sorghum and perennial sorghum. So Stan may give more details about this project and the way forward. And our colleagues who happen to be here today from the University of Georgia, that's Dr. Andrew Patterson and Wen Chen, have confirmed that these diploids are coming from a cross between tetraploid cultivated sorghum and tetraploid perennial sorghum. They're also doing a lot of genotyping work to give us more genetic insights into what's happening or what's leading to these diploid rhizomatous lines. Stan, would you want to add some more?
And thank you, Fiona, for staying up here to endure some high praise when I know you'd rather go back down there and sit down. But we have bittersweet developments. Fiona is going to be leaving us at the end of the year to move to Tifton, Georgia, where finally, at long last, she and her husband Shannon and their two daughters can all live, work, and go to school in the same zip code at the same time. It's been a long time. Since Fiona arrived here as a postdoctoral fellow in 2013, some of the most exciting developments have happened in the perennial sorghum breeding work, and the one that she just described, which I'm thinking it's probably going to be a real breakthrough. Fiona was right in the middle of that one, identifying the diploid plants, and has been in the middle of all the other ones. By my count, the years that she's been here have produced 7 research papers, either published or ready for submission to journals in a wide range of research, and another legacy, not a publication, but since 2013, Fiona and Sheila Cox have taken tetraploid interspecific recombinant inbred line population from the F2 to the F13. Now, most of you will have to take my word for it that a tetraploid interspecific recombinant inbred line population in sorghum will be a very valuable genetic resource that will make possible a lot of research on the basic genetics of perenniality and other traits in the future for any researchers who want to use it. Now, Fiona, we're working on ways that Fiona will be able to continue collaborating with us while she is in Tifton, which with a university and a USDA research station has a history of sorghum research there. So we look forward to that continuing. I am also going to be departing the sorghum project gradually in the coming months, moving over to ecosphere studies. So it'll only be a move of 200 yards or so. But I will be also sort of tapering off the work on sorghum and working with Megan Gladbach, our perennial sorghum technician, on keeping the breeding cycle going, and will until someone else takes over. So if I can direct your attention to the graph over here, the red area, the x-axis is the next, in the coming months, we'll say, is the x-axis. The red area is Fiona's and my combined efforts in perennial sorghum. Will be following that, be following the red area. The green is Megan keeping the sorghum work going during this time until eventually we restaff the sorghum project with others who can work with Megan in the project. Thanks. You want to introduce Lee?
All right. On that note, we would want to introduce Dr. Lee DeHaan, the lead scientist for cancer, intermediate wheatgrass. Thank you.
It's great to be up here to talk to you today because my bottom was getting really sore sitting over there. It's a relief to come up here and stand for a while. We're almost finished. Hang in there with us through a couple more projects that we have. As was mentioned, I lead the Kernza domestication program. Intermediate wheatgrass was the name of this wild perennial grass. And I'd like to make sure that I say that I wasn't the one to start this program. It actually started with the Rodale Institute and then the USDA Big Flat Plants Materials Center from 1990 to 2000, worked on developing this wild perennial grass as a grain crop. And then we started here in about 2000 to 2003, actually began a program of taking this plant that grows leaves and stems really well, and cattle like to eat it, and that's what it's grown for in the western part of the U.S. And we're encouraging it to make a whole lot more seed that tastes a lot like wheat seed. So if you get a chance to try some of the food trucks that have Kernza or the pancakes this morning, or I think there's maybe, I don't know if there's any left, but there was flour available for purchase. It's the kind of plant that we're starting to be able to grow enough to actually do things with it and eat it and use it sort of like wheat. So it's exciting times for us as we make that transition. So this wild grass is a little bit different than like we talked about with sorghum or wheat, where we had sorghum's already a great crop, makes lots of yield. In this case, we have a grass that does all the things we wanted to do ecologically, of taking up nitrogen from deep in the soil and holding on to soil and building soil carbon and outcompeting weeds, but we just don't have enough grain produced on it. So I spend all of my time thinking about how do I increase yield, which is kind of ironic because as a grad student, I was kind of skeptical about the whole yield thing. I'll tell you a little story that kind of put me onto that. We had an economist, I don't remember the person's name, came to our department in agronomy and plant genetics to talk about the economics of plant breeding, and basically showed a graph that was the exact opposite of the red line. It went up instead, and said, so you guys working in agronomy and plant genetics have made yield go up and up and up and up, and farmers have gotten less and less and less income over time because you're making yields go higher and higher and higher. there's more and more grain and it's worth less and less and less, and they're paying more and more money to buy the inputs to grow that, and that's why farmers are not doing well. So y'all shouldn't have made all that yield because you screwed up farming. And that was point one. Point number two was that he studied the years when farmers make a lot of money and years when farmers don't, and he found that farmers make their most income on years when the yields are the lowest, because then the price goes up more than actually the yield reduction happened. And so more evidence that yield, that we say that the plant breeders are doing it all for the farmers so they can make more money, has backfired on us. And the farmers are making less money even though we have more yield. So I kind of had that perspective, and I enjoyed kind of poking the plant breeders and saying, so are you guys making progress reducing yields so the farmers can make money again? But now I spend all of my time thinking about how are we going to make more yield on Kernza and intermediate wheatgrass, because it is the one thing that's lacking. So there's so much excitement about intermediate wheatgrass, what we market as Kernza, that people want to make it into food products, farmers want to grow it, but we see that the whole supply chain just depends on having enough of it at the cost of production to the point where everyone can actually pay the bills and take it from a field to something that we can afford to buy on a shelf. So yield, ironically, is what now I think about all the time. And I think it is what stands in our way of success right now. So I've been working very hard on this since 2003 to increase yield. And this past year, we put out a trial where we had at least 5 generations, so a starting generation and then 5 generations of selection, all in one field at the same time, planted with a planter like a farmer would plant it, combined with a combine just like a farmer would harvest, to see if what we've been doing has worked or not. And we've worked real hard the last week. Marty Christians, my technician, and the interns threshing and weighing seeds frantically to get some of this data analyzed. And what's exciting is that, again, the opposite direction, it didn't go down, it went up in a very straight line over time. Every generation, we increased the yield by 80 kilograms per hectare very consistently for the last 5 generations. So we're on the right direction. The good news is I've done a couple more generations beyond that. We didn't have enough seed to put them in the trial. And at the early stages, it was taking us 2 to 3 years per generation. And really to do it well, it may have taken 5 years, because that's how long it was taking the USDA per generation. And now we have advanced techniques where we can look at the genes that are in the plants, genetic markers, so that even at the seedling stage, we can predict the best plants. And so we can cut off another whole year, but use data from 5 or even more years to pick the best plants. And so we hope we can accelerate and at least do 1 generation per year. So let's extrapolate a little bit. Something I've been trying to teach my son who's back there not to do with data in high school biology class, that you can't go beyond the edge of the graph. You can't say it keeps on going forever over here. We're gonna do that anyway. So let's say that we can keep on making this progress of 80 kilograms per hectare per year, and what will it take to equal wheat? We would need to increase the yield by another 2,100 kilograms per hectare, which is a lot. But we're making great progress. That my calculations would say that would be about 26 years to hit the yield of wheat. Seed size, also very good progress, about 30 years to equal the seed size of wheat. Now this is really disturbing news to me, not because it's so long, it's because it's so short. So we could have something that yields as much as wheat by the time of my early 70s. And I've been thinking about Wes's quote, "If your life's work can be accomplished in your lifetime, you're not thinking big enough." So I'd been under the impression I was thinking big enough that I would never, ever get there, and I had plenty of work to do. Now it looks like this assumption may be false, but I'm somewhat relieved because the wheat breeders are also making a little progress. So their yield goes up a little bit every year. And so maybe, I'll have the work to carry me through and not make it. There are other things besides yield that's important, and Tim talked about them. We've all talked about them here today. And so, even though I've had a little fun with talking about yield today, why is it that people want to eat it today, and why is it that companies want to make food out of it? General Mills had a cereal box produced that some of you may have ordered through the mail and gotten to eat with kernza grain in it. Exciting times for us, and hopefully we'll have enough to actually have one on the shelf within a year or two. Why is that? Well, it's because of all the other benefits. So it's not just yield, right? We all know that soil quality, the soil carbon, wildlife habitat, the role that a crop can play in a farmer's overall system, providing other benefits, services, the grass that can be fed to livestock, the grass that can be grazed, and provide many contributions well beyond yield. So don't think that I'm just focused on yield, but that my job really is kind of focused there right now. I want to end with my favorite quote from Wendell Berry about the future, since I did go beyond the edge of the graph there. Wendell Berry said, "You can't know where life will take you, but you can commit to a direction." And we can't predict the details of our path to perennial grains, how long it's going to take to get there, what technologies we're going to use, but we can, at least I do, remain very certain it is the correct path to take. Thank you. So in this past year, we've had exciting development, especially for me. Up and through 2010, I was the only person working on this project anywhere in the world, aside from the earlier projects. And since then, we've had just rapid expansion to researchers all over the U.S. and world, as Brandon mentioned. Many of them are actually here with us today. Very exciting work going on everywhere, and farmers wanting to grow it. And initially, basically, if a farmer wanted to grow it, they started emailing and calling me, and if they pestered me long enough, I would send them seed to get them to stop calling. And that wasn't the best way to make decisions. But we've gone through several processes of working out better plans and approaches, and finally, this year, we've hired Tessa Peters, Dr. Tessa Peters, to join us in managing the commercialization of kernza and help farmers learn about how to grow it and connect the farmers to the processors and to the end users. And that's what she's going to tell you about, so I shouldn't steal her thunder. But we're really excited to have Tessa here on our team.
And you all might be excited because I'm the last person talking. So, I want to thank Lee, and I'm really glad that he went first because as the commercialization manager for the perennial grains at the Land Institute, I fundamentally work on kernza for most of the time, but I don't expect that to be the case forever. As you heard, there have been big breakthroughs in sorghum and perennial wheat, and so we don't expect that this will be the only time we take these perennial grains and try to get them onto people's plates. And that's really exciting, and everything that I'm doing, we are learning from. This is a giant experiment, so that's why this is part of the research talk, even though we're talking mostly about commercialization. It still fits into a research program because everything we're doing has not been done before. This really is an experiment. We will learn a lot about how to do it from this pilot program of kernza that we have going on. So 9 months ago, I came on as the commercialization manager after what Rachel has called the Wild West of kernza. As you heard Lee talking about, he basically waited until someone pestered him enough that he was tired of hearing from them and then would send them some seed. And that's kind of how Kernza got into the world and how it's going on. The growers who were growing it were risk takers. It was mostly on small acres, and it was mostly funded by philanthropic investment, which it still is to some extent, but we're starting to see that changing. Now, with my coming on board at the Land Institute, we're trying to move toward more of a proof of concept phase where we want these perennials to get to market. We want to be strategic and coordinated, but we want to ensure that that strategy and that coordination is still vision-led, that we are achieving the mission of the Land Institute as we take these grains and bring them to market and get them on your plates. We want to make sure that we're not moving too quickly, that everyone along the supply chain, that all of our partners are working together. This is a cooperative effort. We are working transparently. We try and keep as much of what we can open so that growers, buyers, handlers, everyone along the supply chain is talking to one another in an open and collaborative environment. We're trying to make sure that it's diverse. We have a lot of small acreages that have been growing Kernza during that Wild West phase, and we're trying to now move toward figuring out how do we grow this crop on larger production acres? What does it look like? What kinds of new agronomic techniques do we need to understand? And then how will we take those larger acreages and what we learn from them and apply that when we're doing polycultures and we're bringing legumes as companion crops or any of the other crops that we start introducing into a polyculture vision. We want to make sure that this process is perennial, that it's enduring, and that we are still ensuring that this is going to be going on for a long time. We're not just letting the crops go and then having no idea what happened when all of a sudden, everyone flees the building and nothing's on your plate. That's perennial. And in order to ensure that this is a perennial system, that this commercialization process works, we need to make sure that we see it as the experiment that it is, that we're asking the right questions and that we're making the right choices along the way. Inevitably, we probably will make one or two choices that we have that we have to redirect on, but we're trying to ensure that we are asking the right questions up front so that as we guide this commercialization process, we know that it is still working on meeting the vision of the Land Institute. And there are two kind of fundamental ways that I think we go about this. The first is very practical. It's very tactical. I'll talk about it a little bit. And then the other is very strategic and a larger approach of thinking about a thoughtful analysis of the hypotheses we have about how this should work. So in the area of the practical, it is about organizing and addressing the needs of growers and handlers and buyers all along the supply chain. So my day-to-day might look like offering technical assistance and agronomic advice to growers who are new to the crop, or connecting them with other growers who already have some experience. It might look like coming up with planting and harvesting and fertilization techniques with our collaborators who are in the supply chain but contracting these acres. I also do a lot of connecting the growers with the researchers. So making sure that if someone has a question about polyculture and about growing alfalfa alongside Kernza, that person's in touch with Brandon, and that those growers have access to all of the knowledge of our collaborators at the University of Minnesota or University of Wisconsin or here at the Land Institute. I also do a lot of work with our buyers and people who are interested in making products from Kernza. So I calibrate them to the idea that this is a perennial grain crop that we have not got 10,000 years of history and knowledge about, that there are going to be unpredictable responses to new environmental pressures, disease, pests, weather, weeds. These, as David was talking about, these are slow relationships. So we have to make sure that everyone who's at the table, everyone who's interested in these perennial crops understands that this is going to take time to work all of these kinks out. We don't have the benefit of the 10,000 years behind us, but we have the urgency that it needs to take a lot less time than that to switch to perennials. And that leads us to kind of developing a strategy to address these kinds of needs. And this, to me, is sort of plays on the care work that Aubrey was talking about. You know, we have to decide what are the right questions to guide this process of commercialization. How do we get a perennial grain to market in a way that takes care of the people that are involved in this system? It's not going to happen on its own. So we do have to think about it all the time and lead this charge by living up to our values and the mission of the Land Institute as we do it. So the questions that we're asking ourselves all as a community who are involved in commercialization are things like, how can commercial products like beer, cereal, or a loaf of bread inspire consumers? How can they inspire makers of products? How can they inspire growers to change a system of agriculture that they have a history in long term and that they already understand, and that's easier in a lot of ways because of that? How can we take markets and make sure that they intentionally support rural communities? What's required of each of us along the supply chain to create an economy that shares the values of the Land Institute? Those values being people, land, and community that all relate as members, that are not in competition, but that are cooperating. This is a process that requires care. It's slow, and it's going to need course corrections from time to time. We are trying not to overdrive the headlights. We're trying to make sure that the choices we make now are the choices that are going to ensure the success of these crops. And that can be really frustrating to any number of people along the supply chain, whether that's the researchers who are, either they could be frustrated that things are going too fast or things are going too slow. It could be the people on the end who are calling constantly saying like, well, I'm a home baker and I want 5 pounds of Kernza. So you all are very lucky, because most people I say, it doesn't really exist yet, but we're trying to get there. So you all have the opportunity today to maybe jump the gun on that. Again, this is an experiment, and it requires us to leave our expectations behind, because those are based on an old way of thinking, on an annual way of thinking. I listened to Winona LeDuc give a talk last year, and she said, you can't bring your old baggage to the new economy. And that really spoke to me. I think that requires a lot of steadfastness and a lot of courage. And I think as a community, the Land Institute is up for it. So I invite you all to share in that ambition and to be inspired throughout this weekend with all of the things that you see, and particularly the research plots, which I hope you get to see, depending on the weather. But also, interact with the staff and be inspired by the Prairie, because that really is the heart of what we're trying to get to. Thank you.